There you are. So we're going to turn the lens now and look at the climate transition from another perspective, and that is from the viewpoint of the billions of people who will be ravaged by rising seas and storms if we do not get this right. Our next guest has been warning of the dangers to smaller nations and coastal communities if we don't address climate change. She's a diplomat, a negotiator, and speaks with great experience and moral authority. So, welcome to the Secretary General, the British Commonwealth Baroness of Ashtal, the Right Honourable Patricia Scotland. How are you?
Oh, no, I'm really well. I'm delighted to be here in Dubai with people who are going to help me change the world and save the planet.
All right, that's laying down the gauntlet. So I want to take you back to early in the Commonwealth's history. 1989, Langkawi Declaration. The Commonwealth warned, and I'm going to read it here, the greenhouse effect, 1989, which may lead to severe climatic changes that could include floods, drought, and rising sea levels. And here we are 25 years later. How does it make you feel to hear those words?
I think it makes me feel incredibly sad, but very determined. Because, as many of you know, the Commonwealth is made up of 56 countries. That's 2.5 billion people, 60% of whom are under the age of 30. But the most important reason why I think the Commonwealth has been so exercised about this existential threat which the climate crisis poses is because 33 of those are small states, 25 are small island developing states, and most of the countries in the global south have been those most acutely affected by climate change. So what happened in 1989 is the small states, many of whom were literally drowning, either in rising sea levels and or in the debt, which has been coming as a result of climate change, got together with the other larger countries and said, look, we have to do something, because if we don't do something, some of us within this family, we're not going to be here anymore. And so 2 years before 1989, they said, we need to get the evidence. There has to be evidence upon which we can base this. And they basically put together the first IPCC report, which then went to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Langkawi, in Malaysia, and the Commonwealth then did the Langkawi Declaration. And I'd invite all of you to read it, because actually it's heartbreaking. Everything that we have seen in the last 25, 30 years, they predicted. And that means, in real terms, we have seen death and destruction and harm, and it's real. And one of the reasons why we are so determined to be the difference we need to make now is because if we don't stop this, if we don't hold to the 1.5, there will not just be individuals who will no longer be here, many of our countries won't be here either. And so, you know, you've heard the slogan, and people think it's a slogan, 1.5 to stay alive.
I remember that from Paris.
It's not a slogan. It's a lived reality for the 25 small states and most of the other developing states in our world. So we are absolutely determined and no longer just saddened.
So how do we make sure that this COP is not a cop-out?
I think what we have to do is what we're actually doing. Because remember that we've been through a period where people said, I'm looking back to 2016 when I became Secretary General, and you'll know that many businesses weren't at COP then. And business wasn't an integral part of the solution. That's changed. We now know that countries on their own are not going to be able to deliver that which we need. We need the economic muscle and power of business to come with us. And we also know that the future is green and it's blue. And we've just about got to the economic tipping point where we are relatively confident that green energy is cheaper, going to be easier and better in the longer term. And now the economics are pointing in the right direction. Solar energy is 80% cheaper. Most of the other green energy sources are 40% cheaper. We know we have not yet properly, we've only got 1% of our energy is coming from geothermal. Huge capacity. I know we've probably got some Kenyans in here, but Kenya now has 96% of her energy coming from green energy sources, and 47% of that is geothermal. But it used to be so expensive to get geothermal out. Now it is really cheap. With a 5 million investment, you can probably do the extraction. So the whole game has changed.
The message seems to be, coming into this climate summit, we are making progress, but the progress is not fast enough. And for some message, that seems sort of reassuring, but I wonder how that message feels when you're standing on the beaches of your native Dominica. In 2017, Hurricane Maria, one single storm, led to losses of over 200% of GDP. Yep. Almost 95% of the island's buildings were destroyed. So talk to me about the aftermath of that hurricane and what that means in terms of rebuilding.
Well, I think the Prime Minister, when he came to the UNGA immediately after Hurricane Maria had destroyed, as you said, 226% of our GDP, he said, I've just come from the front line of the war on climate, because I visited my country on the first plane that was available, and it looked like Armageddon. Dominica is incredibly lush and green and is called the nature island of the Caribbean. It's beautiful. When I arrived, the whole country was brown. Even the bark had been stripped from the trees, and there was not a leaf to be seen. But it wasn't just the economic and physical devastation. What was really heartbreaking was what it did to the people. We only have about 70,000 people. And so often they talk about climate change in terms of money and physical structure. They don't actually talk about the human element. And I'll never forget, there was a woman in Roseau, which is the capital. She'd had 2 children, but she had a son, aged 3. And the hurricane was so terrible. She was trying to get her children from one point to another, and she was holding her 3-year-old's hand really, really tightly because she didn't want to lose him. And he kept on saying, Mummy, you're holding my hand too tight. It's too tight. And he pulled his hand away from hers, and the hurricane took him. And she never saw him again. And 3 years later, she was still walking around Roseau going, has anyone seen my son? Oh. Have you seen my son? And when I think of climate change, I say, yes, I see him. I see him, and I won't forget him, and we're going to make sure that there aren't other mothers and fathers who will have to say to us, have you seen my son? Because we will have seen him, and we would have fixed this. So when you're thinking about climate change, just I think all of us need to understand is deeply personal. This is not some esoteric academic exercise. This is people's lives, their livelihoods, and their countries. When someone tells you your island is no more, and the graveyards of your parents are at the bottom of the sea, and you've lost your culture, your music, your language, and your people, these things are irreplaceable. That is what existential means. Not a word, it's a reality.
And so when we think about those incredible, horrific stories, and then translate that into the years afterwards in terms of the rebuilding and the money that it takes to rebuild, and the indebtedness that Dominica as a country finds itself in, talk about that cycle, that vicious cycle that it's almost impossible to get out of.
Well, I think one of the things that I've seen from the countries who've suffered in this way is the amazing resilience, the fact that they've come back from that they've rebuilt their countries and they're rebuilding and they're trying to build back better. So, for example, Dominica is saying it wants to not only be the nature island in the world, but it wants to be a living lab, that it wants to be the most resilient country in the universe. But how do you do that? Because we then talk about debt. In 2016, when I started on this journey, I remember it was really interesting. People were saying that there was no real correlation between the debt incurred as a result of the climatic incident and the debt the country had. And it took years for people to get the empirical data to say, no, there is a direct correlation. And why is that? When a hurricane or a cyclone comes and hits the country and it removes the bridges, the roads, the schools, the hospitals, and destroys that infrastructure, regrettably, it doesn't take the debt with it. It leaves the debt behind, and when the country has to rebuild, they have to rebuild better. So the bridges have to be higher. So it goes the same distance, but you're probably going to pay twice as much. The houses and the buildings have to be more resilient. So they're going to cost you more. The roads are going to have to be reinforced. So you're probably going to pay twice the amount that you had invested before, plus you still have to pay the old debt and the new debt. And the kicker is this. If you are in a developing state which has been crushed by debt, you can't borrow half the money that others can borrow. And even if you can borrow, you're going to have to borrow at a rate 3 times higher. So you can never be competitive. And if you were so fortunate to be described either as a middle income or a high income country, you're going to get no overseas development aid. So you're going to have to go into the marketplace and compete and try and get the money to pay back. And that is just inequitable and unfair and unjust. And the days when, say, 1945, when we were looking at of how we arranged the system, it said this was all about fiscal rectitude.
Yeah.
If you had fiscal rectitude, you'd be able to manage your budgets and you'd be able to do this and you wouldn't need to do anything else. But what do we know now? We are faced by exogenous shocks which are out with our control. You don't control climate. And particularly if you're in a small state, you've contributed nothing to climate. Maybe the G20 countries have been responsible for 80%, but you haven't. Then you're hit by COVID, another exogenous shock. Then you are hit by the food crisis, which has come as a result of the Ukraine-Russia war, another exogenous shock, all out with your control. And this is the reality. And so a system which is predicated on dealing only with fiscal rectitude, which takes no cognizance of the exogenous shock to which countries, particularly the vulnerable countries, are now subject, is just not real in terms of 2023. And we have to have a fiscal approach to international finance which recognises the reality of the world we now live in and doesn't hark back to a situation which might have been valid in 1945 but is no longer valid today.
And that system that was developed after 1945, some of the institutions are still around, right? So we've got the World Bank, we've got the IMF. They seem to be still somewhat relevant, but there's quite a few calls to reform those. And in particular, the Bridgetown Initiative by Prime Minister Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, has gained some momentum in the last year. And, you know, to simplify, there's sort of three buckets of finance that need to come to nations. And the biggest one we've been talking about a lot here, we'll be talking about further this afternoon, is the climate, the energy transition. So to put solar panels, windmills, that kind of thing. Then there's another bucket, which is around, it won't make people money, but it will save them money. So it's things like your bridges, your seawalls, that kind of thing. And then there's another bucket of money, which is all about the loss and damage, the money that, as a small island nation with a GDP of 0.001% of the whole world's GDP, I didn't do this, right? So, and part of what the IMF and the World Bank or the role that they can play is doing things like absorbing some of the risk from currency investments. They can act as a push to push this money towards the right places. So I wonder what you think of the Bridgetown Initiative, whether it's got some legs, what we might see in this COP.
Well, I think it has got some legs, and you'll know that the Commonwealth came up with the Universal Vulnerability Index very much to help to better manage the exogenous shocks about which I spoke and which this actually speaks to. The thing that I'm actually quite hopeful for, that when we went to the World Bank meeting in Morocco, the IMF and the World Bank and the other international financial institutions have themselves accepted that reform is necessary and that reform is urgent. And there was a commitment from a number of countries to fund the World Bank in a way that it would be able to better manage and better respond. And if you see the synergy now between the leadership of the World Bank and the leadership of the IMF, the fact that they're actually friends is not it's a good thing. And they are seeking to find a holistic, integrated response to this. But I think Bridgetown and what we're doing is like putting a pin on everybody's chair so they can't sit down until they fix this. Because we have to fix it. And what we know is none of us can fix this on our own. But if we come together, we can fix it. And I think what's really critical is us to remember that when COVID came and the world accepted that COVID presented an existential threat to us all, we responded, we acted, we came together, and we fought it. The threat that climate poses is actually an even greater threat. And what is really quite curious is why aren't we now responding with the same urgency, with the same rigor and the same vigor? I mean, I've been saying for quite a while, and I honestly believe this, if you look at where we are now, human genius got us into this mess. The effect of the Industrial Revolution wasn't understood when it happened, but we understand it now. And the consequences of that revolution is being felt, and the benefits, by all of us. And now human genius is going to have to get us out. And some of that human genius we're seeing in terms of the geospatial data that we now have, which enables us to better predict what's going to happen, to better respond. The fact that the satellites that we now have, that the Planet Lab has, and what Will Marshall is doing, and we're helping, gives us a possibility of having a real carbon market. So we will be able to understand how much every tree sequestrates. And instead of making a guesstimate, we'll have an accurate estimate, an accurate calculation, which then becomes something which can create a real carbon market. And that could be a game changer. The fact that we've got enzymes now which can eat plastic and help clean our oceans. So there are huge, brilliant innovations taking place, but it will take all our global genius focusing together on this to come up with the solutions that we need. And I think we can do it if we choose. What perplexes, depresses, and upsets me is when I see we're not choosing. And I think there is a real need for every single one of us who are in this room must be here because we are committed to being a solution. And what did Gandhi say? He said, you have to be the change you wish to see in the world. We can be that change, but we need to choose to be. And I don't think any of us can do this on our own, but I'm absolutely sure, without any doubt, that we can do it together.
Tell me about some of the things that the Commonwealth is doing in particular. You mentioned the Universal Vulnerability Index. Talk about that and how it protects those who need it the most.
Well, what the Universal Vulnerability Index does is it identifies the different areas of exogenous shock, and it's GDP plus, because it's not just about how much you are generating, it's taking into account the vulnerability that you have to climate shocks, to the other shocks, and it enables the figures to be recalibrated so that you are able to get assistance, overseas development aid and other sheltered assistance in a way that will make the reality of your position more bearable. And this is just one of the things that we are doing. The other thing we're doing is we're looking at financing, because many of our small states do not have the empirical data they need to be able to make applications successfully to the green and other funds, and therefore they were often making applications, spending millions of dollars, and then not being able to do it. So in 2016, when I became Secretary General, we created a Commonwealth financial CFA, which is the Commonwealth Finance Access Hub, which is a centre which works directly with the funds to better understand what they want, how they want it to be presented. And we've then put a climate finance advisor in our countries who've been able to assist our member states to make applications. And we've been given virtually no money to do this, to be frank. It's about $7.8 million is all we've had. We've put 19 advisors in. And so far, with that tiny amount of money, of 7.8, we have delivered $316 million into the hands of our member states, and we have $500 million in the pipeline. And that's just with 19. Can you imagine what we would do if we had 50 advisors? Because our advisors work like a pack. We try to make sure that every advisor has a slightly different discipline. So this one might be a biomimicrist, circular economy, symbiotic oceanologist, etc. But together, we're trying to fill the full spectrum. And every application that's made for any country is reviewed by all the advisors. And then what we've done, because there is a whole question of absorptive capacity, we have trained more than 2,500 climate advisors throughout the Commonwealth. So we're not just making the applications, we're building capacity to enable the countries to make it for themselves. And that's really important for us to get the money in the right place. We've got the Commonwealth Charter, Blue Charter, which is dealing with our commitment on oceans. And it's tragic that only less than 1% of all the money going to Sustainable Development Goals is going to oceans. And yet the majority of our planet is blue. It's a no-brainer. It's absolutely bonkers. So we've done that, and just last year we agreed to create the Commonwealth Living Lands, which is enabling us to, with the 3 Rio Convention secretariats, we're working together, and we want to implement those 3 Rio Conventions, and we're having action groups. We've created common sensing, which is using the geospatial data with UNITAR, UNISAT, the British Space Agency, ourselves, Planet, Catapult, a number of others, and we're using that geospatial data to better inform the applications we're making, but also to forewarn our countries about when climate disasters are on their way. And that early warning system means that we've been able to help our countries move millions and millions of people out of the way before disasters happen. So we're saving lives. And then we've got our CSET agenda, which is the Commonwealth Sustainable Energy Transition. But there's lots more, and we've just launched our AI consortium. I was rather stunned to be appointed by Berkeley the 2023 Global Leader for Innovation. And so I went to Silicon Valley, and as my mother would say, who told them to do that? Because all these companies said they wanted to see me. Good move. And so what we've done, all of us, is we've come together and we are creating the AI Commonwealth Consortium, because what we know is that many of our small and developing states don't have the capacity to use AI. They don't have the big computers. So we're looking to see how we can create in the cloud a capacity which would assist them. And my last, which I did on Friday, and I won't tell you what we've just launched the Commonwealth Genius. Okay, so if anyone in this room thinks they have the capacity to be a Commonwealth genius, they can come and join us. But what it really represents is how we use geospatial data to be able to create concrete action in order to face climate change. And we are trying to pull together every expert we know, together with the space agencies, to try and fill those gaps in. So
Fantastic.
I'm sure there's loads of genii in this room up there who would want to come and
Great. You
join
don't
us.
sound like you sleep very much.
Yeah, that's what I think too.
Goals for next year. Well,